Welcome back, everyone. Our next session is an important one. They're all important, but this one's a little different. We traditionally hear a lot about battles and leaders and decisions and debates in World War II. And though this last session just discussed the effects of the blockade and the bombardment on Japan, it was more from a strategic level. And we don't always look at the human cost on the ground. This session is certainly going to do that when we look at civilians in the Crossfire. Though both speakers are new to us for our conference and for presenting here at the museum, they have long been on our radar. First, we will hear from Peter Schrijvers, who is one of Alan Millett's former grad students. He got his PhD from The Ohio State University. Peter has actually been on my radar since 2005 in preparation for my first trip to Europe and the Ardennes when I read his The Unknown Dead book about the civilians in the Battle of the Bulge. Next, we will hear from Robert Matzen, an international bestseller, who is a master storyteller of key Hollywood figures in their World War II service and sacrifice, including Carole Lombard, Jimmy Stewart, and Audrey Hepburn. Chairing this session will be a friend to the museum, the Jenny Craig Institute, and myself, Dr. Stephanie Hinnershitz. She is an assistant professor of security and military studies at the Air Command Staff and College out at Maxwell. And prior to that, she was the senior historian here at the Jenny Craig Institute and the author of a few books, including one she spoke on here in her very first year at the conference, Japanese-American Incarceration, the Camps and Coerced Labor During World War II. To chair our session, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Stephanie Hinnershitz.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. And I'm not going to spend too much time with my opening comments because I want to make sure that everyone is able to get as much as possible from our panelists. But I will just reiterate something that Jeremy had mentioned. As many of you know, there are many books about the Battle of the Bulge that have been written. But what we're going to be doing in this session is getting a better look at what often doesn't appear on maps. We've seen a lot of maps here so far. And X's, O's, and arrows and movements, but we don't always gain an appreciation for what that meant for civilians on the ground. So we're going to hear two different ways to approach that topic, and I will turn it over to Peter.
Good morning. Well, the organizers certainly took a risk inviting a Belgian from Flanders to their conference because now you will have to put up with a strong and jet-lagged Dutch accent. So please bear with me. During the research for my book, Those Who Hold Bastogne, I came across a Belgian eyewitness account that has always stayed with me. It is early January 1945 in Moinet. That is a tiny hamlet just northeast of Bastogne. So there's heavy fighting going on, heavy shelling, and Belgian farmers are hiding in a cellar. And with them in that cellar, also hiding, are a number of soldiers of the 12th SS Panzerdivision. That is, trying to look if my slide appears. Oh, I need to go back.
It's the red button. Yeah, press the red button.
Red button. Yeah, voila. So this is a photograph actually not taken in the Ardennes, but in Normandy of soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division. You can see how young they are. This is, of course, the Hitlerjugend division of young fanatics, started training in 1943, all at age 17. So by the time they're fighting those who have survived Normandy in the Ardennes, they're all around 18. Young fanatics, and in that cellar, at one point, one of these German SS soldiers is brought in, badly wounded, dying, actually lying on the floor, and he beckons to one of the Belgian farmers to come closer, and the farmers, the Belgians, by then know what SS stands for, so he, of course, does what the soldier says he needs to do, comes closer, and the soldier, from his bloodied breast pocket, pulls a large-sized photograph, and it's a portrait photograph of Adolf Hitler, and he shows it to the Belgian farmer, beckons him to come even closer, and he whispers, "If I die, I'll die for him." So an 18-year-old in the throes of a battle that he knows is lost and still willing to die for the Führer. So this story, in my mind, illustrates the German determination in the Battle of the Bulge that plays out at all levels. At the top level, of course, we've heard on a number of occasions already in this conference about Hitler's massive and delusional ambition, as many of the best generals around him knew. He does not just want to cross the Meuse and capture Antwerp and sever the scene between British-Canadian forces on the one hand and American forces on the other hand. He wants the Western Front, as a result of all this, of course, to implode so that he can have the Western allies then sue for peace and then turn his attention towards the Soviets and simply defeat them and win the war. It's his last, final, desperate gamble. At the ground level, you see German troops sharing some of that ambition, feeling massive relief. They've been on the run for almost half a year by that time. They've been involved in heavy fighting, but it's mostly defensive fighting, whether it's Aachen or Hürtgen, the Siegfried Line campaign. It's all defensive warfare. And now they're on the move again as they were at the beginning of the war. In one of the diaries that I found of a soldier of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, not just any division, that is the division that will, in the first instance, completely encircle Bastogne. A soldier writes day 1, day 2 in his diary, quote unquote, "It makes us feel like it is 1940 all over again." So this is the kind of spirit that imbues them. And it is this German determination at the top, at the ground level, and the ferocity that caused, of course, more than 80,000 American casualties, dead, wounded, imprisoned. But of course, it made Belgian and Luxembourg civilians suffer too. This is a photo taken just a couple of days after the arrival of Patton's Third Army in Bastogne. You can hardly speak, it's called the corridor into Bastogne. It's not a corridor in my book. I've described it as more of an umbilical cord that can be cut at any moment. But even with this just being an umbilical cord into Bastogne, created by the Third Army into Bastogne from the south, you see that one of the first concerns of American troops arriving is to get the civilians out, to get them out of the way so that they're not suffering, but also not hampering the fighting, of course, the operations. Now, I knew early on the extent to which civilians had been suffering in Jordaan's counter-offensive from anecdotal evidence. I spent as a teenager, being Belgian, many of my summer holidays in the hamlet of Meuderscheid, which is close to Bulge, northeastern part of the Bulge territory, and actually spent it in a farm that we stayed in that was on a smallish road, surprisingly small, but the exact road where Kampfgruppe Piper passed through in December 1944, just shortly, of course, before encountering American troops, imprisoning them, and then shooting them at Bonnier near Malmedy. So these civilians told me tales summer after summer, not just of American soldiers and German troops, but also of civilian suffering, tremendous fear, many villagers badly wounded, many villagers killed. So I was quite surprised much later to find this sentence in Stephen Ambrose's new book then, Citizen Soldiers, when it was published, I believe, in 1997. And I quote from his chapter in this book on the Battle of the Bulge, which says, "If a village had been or was the scene of a battle, the civilian population was usually gone. So how to understand this, I wondered? Was Ambrose perhaps confused by the fact that American troops did create an evacuation zone, a buffer zone, in the shadow of the West Wall on the Belgian-Luxembourg border with Germany? But that was only, of course, a relatively small sliver of territory, and elsewhere in the Ardennes, most civilians had simply remained. It was, after all, as we have seen also in this conference already, a surprise offensive. It took the Allies by surprise, so certainly it took the civilians by surprise. So whatever Ambrose had meant by it exactly, he inspired me in order to not have this misconstrued, to set out documenting the fate of the civilians in the Battle of the Bulge in greater detail, something no historian had tried to do before. And I must contradict Steph here just briefly in that I did write a history, The Unknown Dead, on this with arrows and operational moves and maps. Sorry, Steph. But I rewrote it entirely, seen through the eyes of the civilians. What did all of this on the map mean for civilians on the ground? And then you get, of course, a completely new, fresh perspective on that big campaign. So the project took me many, many years of puzzling it all together, because it depends very much on scouring local studies, villages, towns, and so on, going through municipal archives, parish archives, Red Cross archives, and so on. And so in the book that I eventually published on this, The Unknown Dead, I revealed that no fewer than 3,000 civilians lost their lives in the Ardennes, a thinly populated agricultural area. And it gets interesting if you break that number further down on the basis of the research that I did, namely the majority of civilians, as was to be expected, were killed, of course, in the back and forth of ground battles. But in addition, of those 3,000, an estimated 1,000 were killed in airstrikes. And so we know by now, as a result of the conference, everything about the weather patterns in the Ardennes. There were basically 3 weather patterns. You had the first week from the 16th to the 23rd, where you had Hitler weather, as American soldiers called it, which was foggy, cloudy, and of course, the Allied air forces could not operate. And then on the 23rd, and the American soldiers would say miraculously in their memoirs, Russian high moves in from the east, the sky's clear to a perfect blue, it gets crisp and cold, and the Allied air forces get going. We've heard a talk yesterday from Air Force historians about what that entailed. Well, it certainly also impacted, of course, the civilian population. So that means that 1,000 civilians were killed as collateral damage, but more specifically, the German Air Force was almost nowhere to be seen in the Bulge, and some limited attacks here and there, also over Bastogne around Christmas, but that was it. So most of those 1,000 civilians were killed, of course, in Allied airstrikes. It was friendly fire. On the one hand, Jabos, as the Germans called them, Allied fighter bombers and tactical support of ground troops, also, of course, targeting homes and farms and so on, and killing civilians unwittingly. But most casualties falling here as a result of the heavy bombers and the medium bombers, creating what the Allied forces call choking points. So what you see is that a number of these Ardennes, the larger towns that have crossroads and roads that are very important to use in this rugged, forested area, will be completely erased by these bombers. Ardennes, again, thinly populated, many of these towns, not large towns, none of them, including Bastogne, more than a population of 4,000. That's it. But many of these towns wiped away to create choking points that during the offensive phase, Germans then could not pass through on the way to the west. But then when the tide turned against them, they could also, of course, not escape from the Bulge trap when they wanted to. But many civilian casualties as a result. And then there's also a sizable group of civilians that fell victim to German war crimes. At one level, committed by combat forces. And before I get into the German war crimes, I forgot, this is a photo of Ufalis in the center of the Bulge, where ultimately in mid-January 45, Allied troops from the north and south will meet up and close off the Bulge at its center, at the waist. And it gives you an idea of how ruined many of these towns were, including the Panther that has been German Panther thrown into the river and that now today is shown in perfect condition in the town. Do go and visit. German war crimes. At one level, they are committed by combat forces, specifically the Waffen-SS, and most importantly by Kampfgruppe Piper. Do not forget that after the Malmedy massacre, and that many in the US know about very well, these same troops moved on and on a longish stretch of road between Stavelot and Trois Ponts, they showed the exact same behavior towards civilians, blaming them for being francs-tireurs, of having worked with American troops, never any shred of evidence of that. In total, in just 1 to 2 days on that road, they kill about 120 Belgian civilians, many women, many children, as young as 6, 5, 4, so certainly not the francs-tireurs, the partisans that they claim them to be. Perhaps even more chilling, if that can be, were the war crimes committed by Nazi security forces under SS control. So you have on the one hand forces operating inside the Ardennes now, following in the footsteps of the combat forces, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, especially the SD, working in the Ardennes with an Einsatzgruppe L, subdivided into various commandos, and they import the bad habits of the Eastern Front, where many have cut their teeth previously, where they rounded up and killed Jews and Soviet commissars and partisans, and that's the word they use constantly. They're in search of partisans, meaning former resistance members. You have to keep in mind when the Germans launch a counter-offensive move into Belgium again, this is a country that was liberated by British and American forces since September 44. So there were various Belgian resistance factions. The most well-known is probably the Secret Army, but by December 44, the Secret Army was no longer secret. All of these people had been feted. They had stepped forward. Their names, their photographs had been in newspapers. Photos were shown in store windows. So now these security forces move in unexpectedly, and they start asking for names. They have lists, and they start rounding them up. My own great-grandfather was in the Secret Army. He lived in Flanders, but my grandmother, I never knew him personally, often talked about how panicked he was when he heard that the Germans were coming back, because he too now in his community was openly known as a resistance fighter. So he stayed safe. Many others in the Ardennes did not. About 100 of them were captured, oftentimes executed with a neck shot. That was the style they used, or sent to concentration camps, from which many, of course, never returned. I think in my research this was the most chilling aspect, to imagine that this is a last desperate gamble, oftentimes with German units that they know are under-equipped, understaffed, and still they spend so much time organizationally, in terms of resources, on having security forces in that chaos move about, sometimes in towns and villages just liberated, to just weed out the enemies of the state. Very typical for, of course, a totalitarian regime. I have just this photo of civilian damage and suffering, because some of the photos that have come out of these war crimes are so gruesome. I've published them in my book, but I prefer not to show certainly the suffering of children in public. In closing, the Belgians and Luxembourgers paid a high price for the return of the Germans. The Americans paid an even higher price, giving the civilians their freedom back a second time. The gratitude in the Ardennes for having been liberated by Americans not once, but twice, is still very much alive in the region, despite the occurrence of much friendly fire, as I just described. Friendly fire has, of course, in the region left emotional scars among many, but rationally, it is, of course, also understood generally as the inevitable consequence of liberation, as Hitchcock in his book once said. It's not just the road to liberation, but the bitter road to liberation. And so new monuments of thanks were erected, thanking American troops, British troops, immediately after World War II, and they keep being erected in the Ardennes. New museums continue to be built too. I just helped develop, for example, one in the coal cellar of the former Belgian army barracks in Bastogne, where, of course, Anthony McAuliffe hunkered down with his team during the siege. Do pay it a visit. Just opened about 6 months ago when you're in Europe again. It's called the Bastogne War Rooms. And do pay a visit also, if you haven't done so already, of course, to the Mardasson Memorial. This is a photo of the Bastogne War Rooms, by the way, that was just opened half a year ago, and where I was the lead content expert for. And this is, of course, a photo taken during a documentary filming for the Smithsonian at the Mardasson Memorial, erected by the Belgian people as early as 1950. It's massive, and in its center, a stone bears an inscription in Latin. I don't know why in Latin. We have 3 official languages in Belgium, but Latin is not one of them. I imagine that by 1950, the Belgians understood that the Americans now were in Europe the new Romans, and they weren't far from the mark, of course, in the mid-20th century. But it says, it reads, and here goes my rusty Latin, Populus Belgicus memor liberatoribus Americanis, which simply translates into the obvious when you stand at the huge memorial. The Belgian people remember their American liberators. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And if you want to see those maps, buy the book. If you want to see. So now I will turn it over to Robert.
So we're, instead of, we were in the Ardennes, now let's go roughly 150 miles north, due north, into the Netherlands and talk about civilians in the Netherlands at the same time period, 1944-45, as seen through the eyes of a Dutch girl who happens to grow up to be Audrey Hepburn, who was of the family van Heemstra. If you're Dutch, you probably have heard the name van Heemstra. It is one of the oldest and most famous Dutch families since the founding of the Netherlands in the early 1800s. So I don't know how well you can see this, but I wanted to sort of give some street cred to Audrey Hepburn as an eyewitness to war by showing you some grounds you probably are familiar with, and some names you know, like the Hotel Hartenstein, the Hotel Tafelberg, St. Elizabeth's Hospital, right around the corner from which is Urquhart's hideout in that loft, and then the Arnhem Road Bridge. So those are some things that we all have heard about. Now let's superimpose some Audrey Hepburn things on top of that. Villa Rostenburg was across the street from the Hotel Tafelberg. There lived Audrey's grandfather, and when Audrey was a child, she was dumped there for weeks on end by her parents, Nazi sympathizers. And that was just, if you took a baseball, you could throw it straight through a window of the Tafelberg from the Villa Rostenburg. That's one. Audrey learned to dance. She was the most famous dancer in Arnhem as a teenager. Around the corner from the end of the bridge deck, the Arnhem Road Bridge deck, was her dance school, the Arnhem Music School, and 1 block up from that was the Arnhem City Theater. And on the far right, you can see Villa Bokenhof, which is where Audrey lived for most of the war, in the village of Velp, which is right next door to Arnhem. And one of Audrey's neighbors was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Nazi ruler of the Netherlands. After D-Day, he sought safety farther east in the Netherlands. Arnhem and Velp were safe places. They were also very wealthy places, Dutch East Indies money. On the left, you can see, maybe you can see, Arnhem is dead center in the country, and it's only 30 miles from the German border. So, okay, September 17th, the war comes to Arnhem. Arnhem had been pretty well secluded, although there had been some airstrikes in recent weeks that might have given people like a little heads up that, something might be happening here. 1st Airborne comes down west of Oosterbeek, and we know what happens. 1 battalion makes it to the bridge, and a 9-day battle ensues from Oosterbeek to Arnhem Central. On the left, you can see what's left of John Frost's headquarters at the end of the bridge deck. That building in the foreground on the left was his headquarters, and that's all that's left of it because, of course, the Germans destroyed Arnhem Central to root out any British 1st Airborne that were hiding there. On the right is Audrey's music school in ruins. It had been blasted by a tank. And it ended Audrey's dance career in Arnhem. Now let's take a step back and learn more about the civilian Audrey Hepburn and her family. On the left, you can see her sitting on a hillside in Arnhem in 1942, age 13. In the center is Audrey in the 1930s as a little girl in Oosterbeek. And she's sitting with her Aunt Mesja and Uncle Otto. Otto Ernst Gelder, Count von Limburg-Stirum, district attorney in Arnhem. On the right, you can see Otto and Mesja with Ella von Heemstra, Audrey's mother, you have to say, devout Nazi sympathizer at this time. In 1942, August 1942, Otto was executed with Audrey's cousin, Baron von Schimmelpenninck, in the first Nazi execution of civilians in the war as a reprisal for Dutch resistance activities. They were taken out into the forest and shot. They became known as the Five. And it changed the whole von Heemstra family dynamic, and it changed Ella's Nazi sympathies because this was now family. This was personal. 1 year later, Audrey joined the Dutch resistance. And it was doubted during her career. She would talk about, oh, I did this and that for the resistance. And people would say, come on, she was a kid. What could she have done? Well, when you're on the ground researching the Dutch resistance in the Netherlands, you find out that the children did a lot because the Germans did not think of them as a threat. So it was children who ran messages, and it was Audrey at age 14, because she could speak fluent English, she had gone to boarding school in England. And why was it important that she could speak English? The Allied bomber stream is going overhead every day, going over Arnhem to Germany. And just north of Arnhem was the Dalen Air Base, Fliegerhorst Dalen, and the Diogenes Command Center, which I toured. It was awesome. And so the German fighter response was based basically in Arnhem. And so there were air battles overhead every day, and lots of Allied airmen came down over Arnhem and to the north, and it would be Audrey who would run messages to them. Go to a certain place at a certain time. She took food to downed airmen. After the Battle of Arnhem, the von Heemstras at Villa Bokenhof actually sheltered one of the Red Devils in their cellar, which she thought was, for the rest of her life, she was so proud of that. And she told her son Luca about it and said, this was us doing our part in the war. In the center, you can see Dr. Henrik Visser te Hooft, who was like this swashbuckling resistance leader, the main resistance leader in Velp. Audrey served as a volunteer assistant for Dr. Visser te Hooft. And that's how she got into the Dutch resistance. And by this time, you know that the von Heemstras were okay because Dr. Visser de Hoof did use her in these resistance capacities, even though her mother had been a Nazi sympathizer and had dated a Nazi officer. After the battle for Arnhem, the city was evacuated. 100,000 refugees. They were told to get out of Arnhem with less than 24 hours' notice. This was so that the Germans could conduct house-to-house raids and get any First Airborne out that were still there. And the battle lines hardened so that the Germans were north of the Rhine, and the Allies got up to the south part of the Rhine. And there were fighter attacks on the main street of Velp because Velp went straight from Germany to Arnhem. It was a main supply route, the main street of Velp. Audrey told a story of how she was walking up the street as a convoy was going past one day, and a British fighter came down, strafed the street. A German soldier pushed her under a tank as the bullet stitched past and saved her life. And that was the experience of one civilian. Another fighter attack on the main street of Velp, which I was reminded, I read my own book, it's pretty good. Killed 17 civilians, and one was the mother of a little boy who then turned to Audrey at the hospital for comfort. And he told the story, he died after he told me this story, but it was just brought tears to your eyes, how this girl, teenage girl, is comforting this 6-year-old boy who's just lost his mother. So the Germans were really mad after the Battle of Arnhem. There was a rail strike, and generally the thing was, the Germans were really jealous of how the Dutch people thought of the invading Allied Air Force, the 101st Airborne, the 82nd, British 1st Airborne. They were the liberators. And boy, did that make the Germans mad. And so they cut off food to the entire country. So I was, in reading Peter's book as sort of a setup for my own talk today, I was struck by the similarities for what the civilians experienced. And of course, the first thing is these firefights erupt. There's no warning. All of a sudden, there's this shooting going on around your house. You take to the cellar, and you either live or you die. Sometimes a grenade would roll down the steps of your cellar, and that would be it. There were executions. It wasn't just Otto and Baron Schimmelpenninck and 3 others. There were executions. Audrey talked about how a street in Arnhem would be shut down, and she would hear a volley of gunfire. The street would be opened up again, and there would be a pile of Dutch men against the wall. She saw it. There were refugees in both countries, lots of them. And as soon as people would leave their houses, the Germans would loot. They would stuff carts full of loot and take them back into Germany because it was so close. There was the scarcity of food, but also as winter set in, and we know how brutal that winter was of 44, 45, there was a lack of fuel and firewood because it was sent east to Germany, where there was that terrible bombing, whole cities destroyed, and to the Eastern Front. And there was a lack of coats and blankets because the Germans confiscated them also to take to people in Germany and to the Eastern Front. Fuel and firewood was in short supply, coal especially, and the previous winter had been so bad, the Dutch had already burned their picket fences and a lot of the trees that were in Arnhem and Velp. So that was another big problem, and it led directly into the hunger winter. 4.5 million Dutch without any food, and it went on for months. It was worst in Amsterdam and Rotterdam in the western part of the country, but everybody was affected, including Audrey Hepburn, who in that winter suffered acute malnutrition and anemia and pneumonia, and the malnutrition led to edema, which I personally experienced not a year ago because I had a health issue, and malnutrition sets in, and all of a sudden, your legs are swollen, and it's like, what the heck? And Audrey, for the rest of her life, would show you the stretch marks on her ankles and say with pride, she got that in the hunger winter. So the famine was broken finally in March and April by Swedish ships that were allowed to bring in food finally because the Germans realized they were going to lose the war, and we don't need to pile up any more war crimes. We got enough. And there were of course Allied airdrops of food too, and they were depicted in the last episode of Masters of the Air. And when my wife and I saw that, Mary said, "They're dropping food to our people," because we had made so many friends in the Netherlands from the research for this book. So we took that personally. That was a nice little touch in the last episode of Masters of the Air. So when I wrote Dutch Girl, I dedicated it to the people of Velp for what they had gone through. I had learned so much about them and their courage. There were 600 Onderdijkers, Jews in hiding, in Velp proper. And Velp is a village, but they had 600 Onderdijkers there, some of them in neighboring homes to Villa Boekenhof, where Audrey was. And when the Dutch edition of Dutch Girl was released in September 2019 for the 75th anniversary of Market Garden, there was a big ceremony. There were parades. It was a national thing. I got my name on a historical marker, and I did not have to die to do it. So that is the story of some civilians in Arnhem and Velp, and one in particular who told stories that now make a whole lot more sense when you put them in context. And this is shameless plug time. Dutch Girl is the book that I've been talking about. Also, I wrote Mission, about Jimmy Stewart's combat career as an aviator in the 8th Air Force. It details all 20 of his missions. Incredible story there. And then the third in what my publishers calls the Hollywood and World War II trilogy. Nigel isn't the only one who's written a trilogy. Is Fireball, about Carol Lombard's plane crash that killed her. She was an actress, and she died 6 weeks after the war started on a Bond tour. So I'm happy to take your questions. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much.
All right, so thank you to both of our panelists. And I have a few questions for each of you, and then if we have time, a question to draw everything together. And I want to start with you, Robert, because for anyone, and I hope everyone buys the book, this is really as much a story about Audrey's mother, Ella, as it is about her. And you did mention her, and you did mention that we have to refer to her as a Nazi sympathizer. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about her, and especially how she was able to maneuver in wartime Europe and eventually get to America.
Ella is a very interesting character, and she became a deep, dark secret that Audrey had to carry with her for the rest of her life. Audrey was deeply ashamed of her mother's Nazi ties and Nazi roots. Ella had been to Hitler's office in Munich and had her photo taken with Hitler in 1935. So the fact that she was pro-Nazi, and Audrey's father was imprisoned throughout the course of the war because he was a Nazi spy. This is what Audrey had to work around through her career. But Ella was very charismatic. Audrey's son Luca was crazy about Ella. I mean, he didn't approve of what she had done either. But she was very charming and very charismatic, and it allowed her to maneuver around, what she had done earlier and sort of reinvent her, not sort of, she actually reinvented herself after the war and became sort of a Hollywood mother, like a stage mother, and that's how she did it.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to stick with the theme of memory and ask Peter if you could talk a little bit more about how this aspect of Battle of the Bulge is remembered at this time. So you give some time in your epilogue to discuss this, and you did mention this at the end, but could you, since you are at the National World War II Museum, and we do have an interest in public history, but just discuss a little bit more about the work that's being done to memorialize what you focus on in this battle.
Well, there's much work going on these days with regards to what happened to the civilians in the Battle of the Bulge. I think I wrote my book several years ago, The Unknown Dead, and at that time it was rather exceptional to focus on that kind of aspect of the campaign. Ever since, for instance, one of my good colleagues, Mathieu Bila, is now the director of the Bastogne War Museum next to the Mardasson Memorial. He, for example, has followed in my footsteps and extended the analysis into a reconstruction. That's another aspect, of course, of warfare in these kinds of campaigns that is often neglected. He has written a study entirely on the massive amount of rebuilding that was needed in the Ardennes, which in some areas lasted into the early 1960s. So what you see now in public history especially, which is what I've been involved in the past 8 years, you see that the civilian perspective is really now become deeply integrated into the general story. If you walk into the Bastogne War Museum today, for example, you have 4 main characters showing you through the museum. One is, of course, an American soldier. The other is a German soldier. We've come to the point now, 8 years after the war, that also in Belgium, we're willing to integrate the German perspective. For a long while, that was impossible or hard to do. So you have an American and a German soldier. That is an evolution. And then you have 2 civilian characters. You have a woman, a young teacher in her early 20s, and you have a boy, a 13, 14-year-old boy. And so that allows the museum to tell the story of the Battle of the Bulge also through the eyes of the civilians.
Excellent. And to stay on that, one thing that you both mentioned in your presentations, and it's really a connecting theme, is how children factored into both of these stories, whether it's Audrey, who becomes obviously more well-known, or the many children in your book, Peter, and there's a lot of that in your book when you're looking at the civilian aspect. But could you explain how by including children in your histories, we get a different understanding, maybe not just of the Battle of the Bulge, but the broader aspect and the broader topic of World War II in general?
Yeah, sure. What you see is that, these past, especially last 10 years, whenever there is a project on World War II in Europe for a book or a temporary exhibition or a new museum, you see that there's always the instant first scramble for the last witnesses. Who are they? Where are they? Can we still interview them so that these are preserved for the future? But of course, when you're doing that, certainly these past few years in projects I've been involved in, you're actually talking to people who were sometimes just 6, 7, 8 at the time of the war, because this is how people are aging. The last witnesses are disappearing. So those you're interviewing were at the time, by definition, children. And it gives you not just a new perspective on the war, but it also stimulates the writing of new approaches at all kinds of levels. The British film director Steve McQueen has just brought out, or is bringing out Blitz, on the Blitz against London, Great Britain, but it's seen through the eyes of a child. I don't think that's a coincidence because of all of these recent witnesses being children at the time in the war. And so studies too, there are a number of studies now written in Europe and in Belgium on the children of collaborators. What did that mean for these children to grow up like that with the stigma? The children of resistance fighters who oftentimes, had children at the time and then they disappeared, never returned from the concentration camps. But interestingly, for instance, enough also studies on, again, because children are being interviewed, children of German soldiers during the occupation or of Allied liberators. There's a very interesting study done near Margraten in the Netherlands, where in Margraten there's a huge rather American cemetery of about 10,000 dead buried there or remembered on the walls of the missing. The graves were dug at the time for several years by African American troops, quartermaster graves registration companies, and of course they had relations with Dutch women, and so offspring. That was immediately noticeable, of course. It could not be denied. This was an area all white, that these were children, first of all, illegitimate, and secondly, and also a race factor playing into that in the Netherlands, of course, they were colored, and this was strange, and it pointed towards the fact that these were children of liberators, carrying a stigma. Some actually being placed in institutions to escape the stigma. So a whole slew of studies are coming out that are all the result of the fact that the last witnesses were children at the time of the war.
Yeah, and it was very personal for me, talking to people who knew Audrey Hepburn in the village of Velp. They were children at the time. They still called the Germans the Muffen. You know, a derogatory term that they carried with them all their lives. And one Annemart Visser-te-Hooft, who was a daughter of Hendrik Visser-te-Hooft, the resistance leader, her daughter married a German, dared to marry a German. And even today, she doesn't, he's just a German. You know, and that's, 80 years after the war. But it remains very personal to them. And one other thing about the Dutch children, after the war, the cemetery in Oosterbeek for the British 1st Airborne, every year they have a ceremony honoring the liberators. And little girls will adopt, a grave and put a flower on it every year. And it's a ceremony that they still continue to this day. And that's pretty cool.
Thank you. Yeah, this really does, by focusing on children, in many ways also demonstrate just sort of how global this whole event was. We know it's a world war, but just seeing all the different, like you mentioned, Peter, African-American troops who go over, I think that's really important. And I have one more question for both of you before we turn it over to Q&A to the audience. Both of you touched on this a little bit in your presentations, but these are tough stories to track down, whether it's having to address the fact that Audrey was very ashamed about some parts of her life and trying to get at that story, or just trying to get at the story, like you mentioned, with last witnesses who were children, and just a lack of resources sometimes for your book. So can you just give us a little bit more about how you actually got the sources for your work?
Yeah, Audrey, it's very Jimmy Stewart-like. Stewart would never talk about his combat career, period. So you've got to find other ways to get at the story. And Audrey was the same way in some regard. She would not admit that she ever danced in public in Arnhem because she would have to admit she danced for German soldiers, which she did, German officers, German soldiers. So you have to talk to other people who were there at the time. You have to look at diaries. There were diaries kept by people in Velp and people in Arnhem, but mostly it's the eyewitnesses. The people that remain, a lot of them were children at that time. That's the way you get at the story. And then the family history was also very important because Luca Dottie, Audrey's son, would, in our marathon sessions, would shed light on things. They weren't really important to him, but they were an important part of the story and context. Yes,
resources, local archives that I sometimes guard in the smallest villages with few means, meaning that the archives were not necessarily well preserved. I've been in basements in some villages looking through municipal archives where I first had to kind of wipe away the mouse droppings to get at the sources. Just to tell you that, that they've barely been used and they threatened to get lost too, so it's a good thing that I managed to see some of them, I imagine. In terms of course, interviewing people, it's always a difficult thing to do. There's always the trauma, whether you're interviewing soldiers or civilians. Certainly when you're interviewing people who were children at the time, it is oftentimes very much unprocessed trauma. These days, whenever something happens in a school, there's immediately counseling for everyone involved. There was, as it was for soldiers, barely any counseling. So there is the trauma, people do not want to talk or they break down during the interviews. I was fortunate, I guess, that's how old I am already, of being able to work on this for decades. So I started working on it when I was in my early 20s. And I got to interview even German troops, German soldiers. In 1984, for example, I was in Bastogne when there was the hoisting of a peace bell into the church tower of Bastogne, and the bell was paid for by American veterans who had been inside Bastogne at the time, and they were there together, fraternizing with those who had also paid for the bell. And these were veterans of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, the 5th paratrooper division, which had blocked off Bastogne to the south to help keep out, or rather, there's no keeping out Patton's Third Army, of course, blocking Patton's Third Army into Bastogne. And so here they were fraternizing, paying for that bell. And so I interviewed, at that time, also German veterans, not just about their battle experience, but also their interaction with civilian population. So I used all of that evidence, those experiences, and kind of mash them into the book.
Yeah, excellent, and thank you both for your research, because now we have these books for you to buy and for everyone to read. So thank you to both of you, and now I will turn it over to Jeremy and Connie.
Great, thank you. We're going to go about halfway back to your left with me, please.
I think one of the most important things that I've gained from being here at the World War II Museum is that it was the way I found out about my dad. He went in as a doctor. He was in 4 years. I was 2 at the time, so I didn't know him until I was 6 years old. And as much as we are now learning because of social media, it was very difficult for quite a few years to find out anything. But I'm very proud of him, and I wish I had time to have talked to him to explain. But, you know, I'm so old we couldn't do that. I wonder if there are people in the room who are like me, who are the children or the child of a soldier who fought in World War II, and if you do, please stand up.
Wow. That's quite a lot.
Next question will be to your left.
Good morning. Thank you very much for those great presentations. I was especially gratified to see the hunger winter discussed for just a moment in the last presentation. I don't think we hear much about that. It gets a little lost in history. I find it very interesting that the children of the women who went through the hunger winter, who were in gestation during that time, there was a British researcher named Barker who found that those children had higher rates of obesity, of heart disease, of diabetes, and that's now become a major topic of study. And I wonder if that's something you guys ran across in your research or have, and I'm especially interested, Dr. Schrijvers, if that's something that's well known in the area. Thank you very much.
Well, of course, you know, the hunger winter is a very well-known subject in both the Netherlands and in Belgium as a neighboring country. So we grew up with these stories. Certainly for Belgians, I'm a Belgian, it was one of the defining characteristics in our minds of the war in the Netherlands. I am aware of the fact that it is less well known outside of the Low Countries and in the United States, but I think there have been a number of studies and the research that Robert has done that is making clear the extent of it and the harm it did to so many civilians. In Belgium, keep in mind, the liberation was fast, speedy. and until, of course, the arrival of the German counteroffensive in December 44. So we never had in Belgium similar problems to those of the Netherlands in that later stage. Keep in mind, however, that the impact of the Ardennes counteroffensive can be felt throughout Belgium. It is, as everyone who studies the Battle of the Bulge knows, the worst winter probably of the 20th century to begin with. And what happens with the German counteroffensive is that it also threatens now coal mining in and near that area that is being used, of course, for warmth throughout Belgium. But it also hampers logistics now for the Allies in Belgium who use the Antwerp port, which was, of course, one of the main targets of the German counteroffensive. All of a sudden, all attention needs to go to continuing to fight this war at a much higher level as a result of the German counteroffensive. Because anything coming in to Antwerp for civilians is now cut down on. So into January, February 45, you start feeling this also throughout Belgium. There's no outright hunger as there ever was in the Netherlands, but it is painful, and it's always been very mind-opening to me to see General Erskine, a Brit who commands the military in Belgium after the liberation, having to go in Brussels onto the radio to have a broadcast to the Belgian people because people they're cold, they're hungry, and he has to go on the radio to tell people at one point saying, well, keep in mind that you do not want to go back, I'm sure, to Nazi occupation and the Gestapo. But the very fact that he has to remind Belgians of this in February 45, with all of the suffering they've had during 4 years of occupation, means that there too, of course, in terms of cold, hunger, there are significant problems. And for civil affairs, that is always a tricky thing to manage, of course, because they need to have behind the front lines a secure, stable environment that cannot be threatened. But yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that a little bit, yeah, that study reveals, high blood pressure, heart problems, obesity problems in those children born during and after the hunger winter. But then the bounce back is incredible. I mean, the succeeding generations of Dutch got ever taller and more fit. I mean, look at this guy, he's an example of really the superior specimens that were produced after the war.
It's merely anecdotal evidence, of course.
We're going to go up to the front, to the right, folks.
You mentioned that the Dutch lady who had children with African American troops, their children were ostracized. I'm curious to see what was the reaction to the Dutch when they had they had children with German soldiers. I know that in France, some of these women were tarred and feathered and ostracized. What was the Dutch reaction to those liaisons?
No. You take that one.
Well, I imagine that many of you know the answer to that to some extent. It was vicious, of course. Women who were accused, I do not know about your research, Robert, into Audrey's family, but the mere hint of the fact that there had been that kind of collaboration between a woman and a German occupier could have the effect. Immediately in the first days of the liberation, you see resistance fighters of the last hour who all of a sudden, of course, come out of the woodwork and claim that they have always been resistance fighters and give a bad name to the resistance that had been in existence for so many years, or vigilantes sometimes simply. They target anyone who's a collaborator viciously, beatings, killings, executions. But women get a very special treatment. They're seen as sleeping with the enemy is really kind of undermining the national identity And so they get a very specific punishment, that of the heads shaven, oftentimes painted upon a swastika or something like that. Women even who are pregnant at the time of liberation, treated viciously. Many of them also during imprisonment, and there are only studies coming out on that now. For a long time, that was very taboo in the Low Countries, but also the rape of women during their imprisonment and so on. So it's not a nice chapter in the history of liberation. And oftentimes you see that liberating troops, be it British or American troops, try to mediate, but sometimes also sense that the anger is such and that it has built up for so long during 4 years that it might be better to just allow the population to vent, some of which then many of these women and many males are the victim. But women got that very specific punishment of the heads shaven, taking away essentially their femininity as punishment.
Yeah, and there was no mistaking. You know, if you had your head shaved and you were a woman, everyone knew exactly what you had done, what you were accused of. And they also had to run, there's home movies taken in Velp on Liberation Day showing women having to run a gauntlet, you know, of abuse from their fellow citizens of Velp, the Velpja. So yeah, that retribution was swift and painful.
Next question is going to be with Connie to the left up front.
This question is for Peter. In your research, did you find any reprisals on the part of the resistance or the civilian population as the German counteroffensive was blunted and they were pushed back? Did the civilian population or the resistance try to bring to justice any of the members of the German security services or execute them outright for the way they treated the population?
Yes, of course. So you see that, for instance, Kampfgruppe Piper, Americans may know that, of course, for their involvement in the Bonnier-Malmedy massacre. There were the Dachau trials that were held, and that very special history of what happens with Piper afterwards, of course. Less well known is the fact that there was a separate trial against the group for the crimes committed shortly afterwards on that stretch between Stavelot and Trois Ponts, killing about 120 civilians in Liège in Belgium. And so they got punishments too on top of the ones that they had already received. Sometimes it involved other soldiers, of course, in these cases, and to the extent that they could be called. Sometimes they were just there in absentia, known by name, but not there in person. So both in absentia and those present receiving prison sentences. No death penalties, as far as I know.
We're going to go in the very back to your right with Dr. Bischoff.
Thank you very much for an outstanding panel. And Stephanie, I was glad you brought up the issue of children because, as Peter suggested, there is a lot of research being done in Europe on children and war. So it's an excellent topic. But I have a question for Peter. Peter, you must know about the Battle of Houghton, as Americans call it, Houghton, where Americans defended against the Germans in a very fierce battle. And in the book I read, I didn't read anything about civilians, so they must have left before the battle unfolded. But I know that the Belgians have put plaques up for the American soldiers too, so it's also a memory story in that sense.
So you're talking about the battle for Houghton?
Right.
Yes.
Yes, and in terms of the civilian population, not entirely gone in Houghton either. I know about, America just putting up stiff resistance there at the river, also plaques being presented for them there. In terms of civilians, however, had remained there too. There was no mass blanket evacuation of civilians anywhere really in the Ardennes. The only exception, as I mentioned in the talk, was that area close to the West Wall on the Belgian-Luxembourg border with Germany. But that took place in the months following the liberation, the first liberation of September 44. They wanted to create a kind of security zone. Even then, the Americans in the villages in that evacuation zone allowed civilians, farmers to stay behind, a sprinkling, so that they could take care of cattle, of the animals, and so on. But the rest of the Ardennes, including Hoton, there was never any mass evacuation ordered. On the contrary, Allied troops did not want that. They were moving in troops en masse towards the Bulge area and could not, of course, have civilians moving out en masse and hampering those operations. Even Bastogne, the inhabitants were told to stay put as much as possible or use a limited number of roads out. So most people stayed. The only exception to that rule in most places, the ones who got out, even just hearing the rumble of artillery approaching that told them something is off, something is wrong, the Germans may well be returning. And for many Belgians, that was difficult to fathom. They had in September 44 seen what the American military might had been. They'd seen the Germans withdraw with almost nothing left. They could not fathom that the Germans would come back. But even as the rumble neared, what you see is young Belgian males who feared the return of forced labor, having to work in Germany. They ran, they were all very quickly, and then of all ages, people involved in the resistance, who were, if they could, and even then, many stayed behind and fell victim. But other than that, most people stayed put, and that includes Hoton.
Next question is going to be with Connie, all the way to your left, towards the back, please.
Thank you both for such a wonderful presentation. I've done some reading about Audrey Hepburn in the past, and I recall hearing that she was more passionate about her dance than possibly her acting, and that the effects of her surviving the Hungerwinter prevented her from pursuing dance to the extent that she wanted to. Could you talk a little bit about that, and as well the effect of the Hungerwinter on the rest of the population going forward?
Yeah, so Audrey did always consider herself a dancer. She never considered herself an actress. And that was because she had not ever been on the stage until she was in one play, Ondine, in 1954. But so she always thought she was a dancer. And yes, the Hungerwinter set her back. And she never quite recovered any of the momentum to pursue serious dance after the war. And unfortunately, as she would tell you immediately on meeting you, she was too tall, ungainly, and ugly to be a dancer. She could never be a ballerina because she had grown too much. She was like 5'8", and your classic ballerinas were not that tall. So yeah, that hampered her career. And she wanted to be a choreographer for a while, and then the acting thing, despite her best efforts to sort of avoid the acting and the spotlight, that's what she became famous for.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause.
Well done.
Thank you.
For coming. Even though we wanted you to be here a long time ago, we finally got around to it, and it's been a delight, and let's hope the next time isn't so far away. And also thank you to Steph, who, though she's left us for her new teaching post, we keep close as our Asness Family Foundation fellow at the Jenny Craig Institute, so we bring her down here about once a month for odds and ends and important sessions like this. Now we're going to break. Our speakers will all be at the book signing station, and we'll be back